So, welcome back to the basics of Magic the Gathering, and this is episode 2 where I talk about the basics of gameplay. And I'm not going to get too deep into it. I covered some of it just to explain the cards in the last video. If you want, go check it out here. And I'm just going to go over maybe the first few turns. I don't know, we'll just wing it, and I'll talk about the things that you do and the things that can be done. So, I'll put some cards up here on the screen, and we'll start with the lands. And let's say you draw 7 cards, which is what you do when you start the game after you've shuffled your deck. And I'll talk about formats later. Let's stick with Commander. So you have 100 cards, and only one of each card, and one of those cards is your Commander, which is face up on the table somewhere. The rest, the other 99, are in your deck, and you draw 7 cards. And then on your first turn, you draw another card. Every turn, you draw a card. Unless there's something out there that tells you don't get to draw a card. Or there's something out there that tells you get to draw more than one card. But in general, at the beginning of your turn, you draw a card. And you do your upkeep where you untap anything from a prior turn that was tapped. Unless, again, something tells you don't untap those things. So, on your first turn, you should have at least one land in your hand, preferably 1 to 3 lands in your hand. Or something else that will provide mana and 1 land, and a way to cast that thing with that 1 land. But it is best to have almost half your opening hand, be a land of some type, because you want to put down a land every turn. It's very important that that happens. So, on your first turn, generally speaking, you'll have a land in your hand, unless you've decided otherwise. And if you don't start with a land in your opening 7 cards, you can do a mulligan. And just look at the mulligan rules. I almost never mulligan, because I usually put more than enough lands in my decks, so that I always have at least 1 land in my hand. So, at the beginning of your turn, after you've done your upkeep, you put down 1 land. And you can only put down 1 land each turn unless you have a card that says otherwise. And then you can tap that land for the mana that it produces. And I covered that in the previous video. So if you tap, say, a Plains, then you get 1 white mana. If you have a spell in your hand that has a casting cost of 1 white mana or 1 colorless mana, then you can cast that spell. It could be a creature, it could be an instant, it could be a sorcery. And again, let's say that you have 1 Plains and 1 island and 1 other land, and you tap all of them. Well, now you have a blue mana, a white mana, and whatever the other color of that is, but let's say it's colorless. Then you could cast a spell that costs you 1 white, 1 blue, and 1 colorless. So, on your first turn, you're mostly just going to lay down a land and not necessarily have anything to cast. Because if you have an instant, there's most instants that cast 1 require a target of some kind or do something in which things have already been happening in the game. But if it's the first turn and nothing has been put on the board except for lands, then it's unlikely an instant or even a sorcery is going to be anything but a waste to put down. But a creature is very valuable to get out on the first turn. Now, then your opponent takes their turn, and then it comes back to you. You untap your stuff, you draw another card, you lay down another land, and then you cast more spells. So let's say you've got a creature out, and it no longer has Summoning Sickness because you cast it on a previous turn. So on the first turn that it casts, it has Summoning Sickness and can't be tapped either to attack or tapped to use an ability. But it can use abilities that don't need to be tapped. But let's say now you have this creature out, it can now attack. And you then declare that it's going to attack, and you tap it. And then your opponent either doesn't have a creature to block with, or does have a creature to block with, and they block with the creature, and one creature kills the other, or they don't kill each other. Then that gets resolved by either the creature that was killed being put into the graveyard, and if it was your opponent's creature that was killed, you will now go, if you have something like Trample, you will now be able to cause damage to the player in excess of whatever the creature was. But if you weren't blocked, then you would cause damage to your opponent with your full power. And like I said, you in the previous video, you can tap it to attack a planeswalker if they have a planeswalker out on the field. But those are the only things that you can target with attacking. Now, there's other things that can happen in combat. You could attack, they could declare a blocker, you could cast a spell to give it a bonus to the creature so that it either has more power or more toughness. They could do the same thing. Someone could cast a counter spell. Another person could cast a destruction, and all that stuff stacks up. And again, it's the stack begins with, say, the attack or the spell that you cast, but in this case it's an attack, and then the next spell that was cast goes on top of that, and the next spell that was cast goes on top of that, and the next spell that was cast goes on top of that. But you resolve the spell that's on top, and then you go down. So, as I said in the previous video, let's say you tap to attack, and you give a +1 to your creature, a +1 power to your creature. So now it's doing 1 more damage. They then cast a spell that gives it -4 toughness, meaning that your creature that had 4 toughness now has 0 toughness, and it's going to die before it does damage to the player. Then you cast a counter spell on top of their -4 toughness. So the counter spell gets resolved first and counters the -4 toughness. Then your +1 gets resolved and it gets +1 power, and it goes through it. It damages the other player. If there's other counter spells in the mix, again, it depends on when they were cast. So it's a last in, first out type of scenario. The other things that you can do on your turn is casting other spells like instants and sorceries, and put an enchantment on the battlefield, put a planeswalker on the battlefield, as long as you have the mana that you can tap to then give you the mana for the casting cost for the creature, or you have a spell that lets you put that thing onto the battlefield for free, or in the case of an instant, lets you cast an instant for free, then you can do that. And that's the basics of gameplay. So, to just recap here, you play 1 land on your turn, unless something says otherwise. You use that land to tap it to give you mana, to give you the mana you need for the casting cost for a spell, and a spell can be a creature, an instant, a sorcery, an enchantment, or it could be an artifact. And then I don't think there's any other card types. And instants can be cast at instant speed, which means they also can be cast on your opponent's turn. But generally speaking, the other spells cannot, unless they have a power called Flash. At which point, then they can be cast at instant speed. So, you tap your mana to give you tap your lands to give you mana to cast your spells, and those spells go on the battlefield, except in the case of instants, where they are instantly used and instantly destroyed, and they go into the graveyard, which is your discard pile. And you use your creatures to attack either a player or their planeswalker. And planeswalkers have abilities that give them loyalty counters, and those loyalty counters then build up, and you can use the loyalty counters on them to use other abilities that say negative loyalty counters. And your planeswalker will probably be attacked by creatures trying to bring down those loyalty counters, because the planeswalkers are quite powerful. An enchantment on the battlefield is usually a static global power that gives something to your battlefield, sometimes to yours and your opponent's battlefields, and it affects certain things on the battlefield or all things on the battlefield. It depends on the enchantment. An instant, cast at instant speed, and it can be cast on either your turn or your opponent's turn. A sorcery can only be cast on your turn, and they are the most commonly considered spells because they feel more like spells than creatures and planeswalkers and enchantments and artifacts. But all of those things are spells because they're cast into existence. They aren't on the battlefield. They're coming from somewhere else. And the sorcery can only be played on your turn, and it doesn't come out at instant speed. So therefore, once there's an action in progress, or once there's a stack in progress, you can't cast a sorcery on it unless you have a card that gives you the ability to do so. And then, if you're playing commander, you have a legendary creature as your commander. And that goes into the command zone. And when they're cast onto the battlefield, like you would normally cast a creature, then they're now on the battlefield. And if they are ever removed from the battlefield, meaning they're put into exile, or they're killed, destroyed somehow, or somehow removed from the game, they can actually choose to go to your command zone. And every time they've gone to your command zone, they cost an extra 2 colorless mana. And you can then bring them back to the battlefield. So they are they are killable, but you can recover them a lot easier than other creatures that get killed, because those ones usually go into your graveyard, and then you need cards that bring things out of your graveyard. But the commander has its own ability in which you can cast it from the command zone. Now, there are certain things that can basically remove your ability to use your commander, and they can be quite punishing. And phasing them out only really removes them for a short period of time, but I don't believe you can avoid phasing out and go to the command zone. If someone takes control of your commander, then you have to find some way to remove that card that gave the player control over your commander, and you can't choose to then instead send them to the command zone. And if someone casts a spell on the commander, a persistent or temporary spell that says this card can't use abilities, well, then your commander has become a little less useful. Or there could be a card that says this creature cannot attack, or whatever, depending on what your commander is there for, whether it's the abilities or it's the power level of the commander and the attacking ability of the commander. But you have to remove those cards somehow to then be able to use your commander, because you can't choose to kill it yourself, right? Unless you have a card that does damage to a creature, you can target your own creatures, that's fine. And then it dies and it goes to the command zone. So that's the basics of how a turn and how a few turns go in Magic the Gathering, and how the cards interact with each other. And I know it's confusing, but again, I would reiterate that I have a hour-long video in which I teach my sister to play Magic the Gathering for the first time, and she's not particularly a gamer, but she caught on quite quickly, and I think that watching it can help you understand the basics of the game. But really, going into your local game store and playing Magic with other people, most people will be more than eager to teach you the game. Now, some people will teach you the wrong rules because they want to win all the time, but that's kind of what happened in Magic. When I first started out, we read the rule book, but we didn't fully interpret the rules correctly, and we often had arguments over the rules. And over time, we learned the rules, and even to date, not everyone knows all the rules, even judges. So, things can go wrong, and it's fine if a rule was missed or misunderstood, as long as both people continue to agree to proceed. That's fine. If there's a certain amount of take back you can do because of certain rules that are misunderstood, and usually a judge decides on that. But if you're a regular person, you can kind of come to an understanding with people, and then moving forward, you remember that type of rule. You're more likely to remember that type of rule because there was that interaction that happened, and then things had to be rolled back, or you missed something, and it just sticks in your long-term memory. So don't worry if you're not getting the rules right. If you're playing in a local game store, someone can correct you. You can ask them, and people are more than happy to share their interpretation of the rules, and they're not always necessarily right. But as long as everyone agrees on this is the rule and this is how we do this rule, and I guess it doesn't really matter, because at that point everyone's doing the same thing, so no one's getting an advantage over anyone else. Anyway, that's that video about the basics of how to play Magic the Gathering. I'm going to go into formats in the next video, and then I'll think about other videos to do from there. But I just wanted to cover the basics of Magic the Gathering so that, you know, if someone doesn't fully understand a video when I'm talking about Magic the Gathering, they can maybe grasp the basics. And I think it was the formats is probably where people who know nothing about Magic the Gathering or are new to the Magic the Gathering may not fully know about these things. So I'll go into that in the next video. Check that out.